Every morning started the same way. Before the sun had even begun to shine through the blinds, I was already awakened by the rustle of clothes and the faint sound of sneakers being tied. Sarah always got up before me. It was a habit of hers. Every morning, without exception, she went for a run. It was her time, her personal ritual that she never gave up. I even admired her dedication in a way, because I had always been far from getting up at the crack of dawn and exercising. My choice was in favor of an extra hour of sleep. We often discussed her morning runs, although the conversations were more formal. Sarah told me how it helped her relax, how the morning air refreshed her mind, how running was her way of dealing with tension. She always came back from a run with a slight smile, as if she had just made some important discovery. She said running was freedom. And I listened to her stories with slight disbelief, but I never questioned her love for it. "Why don't you ever try running with me?" she asked me one day at dinner. I looked at her and only smiled. "You know me, Sarah," I replied. "I'm not the kind of person who gets up at 5 in the morning for a few kilometers in the park. It's up to you, and I'll give you lip service." She just shook her head with a slight smile. She was fine with that. She liked that her morning ritual remained her own business. Lately, however, I've noticed that these morning runs have become more than just a physical activity for her. It was as if she looked forward to these moments like a child looks forward to Christmas. Sometimes she would leave even earlier than usual and return just before I was about to start getting ready for work. It made me a little wary, but I didn't want to ask too many questions. The thought that she might be doing something else besides running didn't even cross my mind. But one morning, lying in bed and watching Sarah get ready to go jogging again, I suddenly decided it was time to make a change. Her passion for sports hadn't made me suspicious for a long time, but this time, I wanted to be a part of her world. Maybe I just wanted to spend more time with her. Maybe it was the fact that we'd been talking less and less lately. Maybe I was just starting to feel like there was some invisible barrier between us, and I wanted to overcome it. "I'll go with you tomorrow," I said suddenly. Sarah froze for a moment, holding her sweatshirt in her hands. She slowly turned toward me, and I noticed something in her eyes that was hard to interpret, a mixed feeling of surprise and something else. Anxiety, maybe? But that feeling quickly disappeared, giving way to a familiar smile. "Really?" She raised an eyebrow. "You hate running." "Well, maybe it's worth a try. I've long wanted to see what you find so great about it." She smiled and nodded, but her reaction was unnatural, like she wasn't thrilled that I was going to join her. For a moment I thought something was bothering her, but I quickly dismissed the thought, deciding it was just my imagination. The next morning I got up earlier than usual. Sarah was already ready as usual. She was standing on the doorstep in her gym uniform, tying her hair into a ponytail. I felt a slight thrill. It seemed like this day was going to be somehow special. It wasn't that I was excited about the run itself. On the contrary, I found it hard and boring. But the thought of spending time together fueled my desire to try something new. We went outside. The air was cool, the morning mist shrouding the trees and houses, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Sarah popped her headphones in her ears, throwing me a brief glance, and started to run. I was certainly hoping she would adjust to my pace, but I quickly realized that was a naive thought. She moved as easily as if she were flying over the ground, while I could barely keep up with her. Every step was difficult, and my breathing began to slow after a couple minutes, but I tried not to show my weakness. We ran along the path that led through the park. It seemed like it was going to be a normal run, no surprises. But I noticed Sarah, a little ahead, turn off the main path and run in a direction I hadn't seen before. It was a strange thing to see. I knew she always ran on the same path in the park, but now she was heading somewhere else. I thought that maybe she just wanted to show me a new place to run, so I decided to ignore it. But then, catching up with her a few minutes later, I noticed that her attention wasn't focused on the run. She looked kind of detached, like her thoughts were far away. The thought that this might not just be a normal jog crept into my head, but I quickly pushed it away. After all, it could have just been a morning where she didn't get enough sleep or was worried about something. When we reached the edge of the park, Sarah stopped abruptly. My heart was pounding so hard that I didn't even immediately notice when she looked at her watch and said, "I'm going to run farther, and you can come home if you want. It's not your pace, I can tell." I took a few steps forward, trying to manage my breathing and realize what was happening. Everything around me seemed familiar, but at the same time somehow strange. This wasn't a familiar run. I could feel it in the air, in her demeanor. Perhaps it just seemed to me that she was different, too aloof or brooding. I tried to convince myself that she was probably just focused on her thoughts, on the rhythm of her run, on her breathing. But somehow that feeling wouldn't leave me. Her suggestion to go home made my anxiety even worse. We kept running. The pace was a little slower now, and I was able to keep up, though I struggled to keep my breathing steady. Sarah was running ahead, her figure gliding effortlessly along the path as if there was no strain for her. It seemed as if jogging was something as natural to her as breathing. Even though I'd known her for a long time and had seen how much she loved this activity, today her confidence troubled me for some reason. I tried to distract myself with thoughts that maybe she just wasn't used to having me around. After all, this was her personal space, her time, and I had invaded it uninvited. But it was so important for me to understand my wife's life. And besides, our conversations were getting shorter and less meaningful each week. I was worried that there was a distance between us that had seemed impossible before. The park was slowly coming to life, but our morning runs were still silent. Rare passers-by with dogs or joggers glimmered on the horizon, but they didn't notice us. I noticed Sarah turn onto a side path that I hadn't noticed before. It was odd. She always ran the same route, following a familiar path, but today she clearly chose a different direction. "Do you run here often?" I asked, trying to make conversation, but really just wanting to know why she had suddenly changed her route. She looked over her shoulder at me, her face focused, as if she was thinking for a long time before answering. "Yes, sometimes," she answered briefly without pausing. The answer didn't satisfy me. This new route seemed completely foreign. I could see the trees changing to thicker vegetation, and the path led to places where there were fewer people. It all looked strange and unfamiliar to me, but maybe it was just her way of diversifying her training, and I was only winding myself up. As soon as I caught my breath, however, Sarah picked up the pace again. It seemed like she was purposely trying to get ahead of me. There was something insistent in her movements, something I couldn't immediately recognize, but something different from her usual running style. When I began to fall behind again, I got the strange feeling that she wanted to run away, not just because I couldn't keep up with her pace, but because she didn't want me around. The feeling was bothering me more and more, but I tried not to pay it any mind. After about 15 minutes of running, when I was out of breath and almost unable to catch up with her, she stopped suddenly at one of the benches at the far end of the park. At first, I thought she was just pausing to catch her breath a little, but her behavior was odd. Sarah didn't just stop. She looked around as if she was looking for someone, even though there was no one around. "Are you waiting for something?" I asked, walking up to her and struggling to catch my breath. Sarah smiled again, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes in any way. She pretended not to hear my question and looked away. I felt an unpleasant feeling building up somewhere inside me, but I couldn't quite figure it out yet. "I think that's enough for today," she said suddenly. "You're already tired, aren't you?" I was taken aback by her tone, not the kind you'd expect from someone who shared something in common with you. It was more like something cold, detached, like she wanted me to come home and leave her alone. "I can run some more," I replied, though I actually felt like my body was on edge. "If you want to keep going, let's run together." She looked at me again, and something flashed in her eyes that I couldn't understand. Maybe it was fatigue or frustration or maybe something else. I started going over in my head again the moments of our morning conversations about her runs, our lunchtime meetings, her tiredness in the evenings. It was all starting to add up to a strange picture that I couldn't quite put together. "You know, I need to take another lap," she said, looking away. "Why don't you come back? You've done enough already, and I'll catch up with you in a couple minutes." Her words sounded too mundane, too casual for me to believe they were sincere. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. On the one hand, she was right. I was really tired and felt like I couldn't go on any longer. On the other, it was too strange that she was so suddenly suggesting that I leave. "Are you sure?" I asked, hoping that she would suggest that I stay, or at least say something more personal. "Yes," she answered without turning around. "I won't be long." Inside me, everything turned upside down. I stood there, watching her turn around and walk further down the path. My heart was beating faster than it should after a normal run, and this time it wasn't about the physical exertion. Everything that was happening felt wrong, like I was an extra in this moment, like I was trespassing where I shouldn't have been. She disappeared around the corner of the path, and I stood there, unable to take a step back. I had a strange feeling that if I left now, I would miss something important. There were too many questions keeping me in suspense, too many things that were strange about her behavior. As I took a step toward the path to try to catch up with her, I suddenly froze in place. The thought flashed through my mind. Is it worth it? As Sarah disappeared around the corner, I remained standing, as if rooted to the spot. A strange sense of uncertainty enveloped me, like I was facing an important choice, to follow her or just go home, as she'd suggested. But something inside me kept me from leaving. Everything that was happening seemed suspicious, even though outwardly nothing much had happened. Sarah had simply suggested I come back, as if there was nothing strange about it. But it wasn't the tone I was used to. It was too detached, too cold. Slowly catching my breath, I took a couple steps forward. My mind was spinning, one thought after another, but I couldn't put them together. It felt like a jigsaw puzzle with key pieces missing. I knew I had to move on, but I couldn't figure out where. My intuition was telling me that if I just walked away, I was missing something, and that feeling kept me on my toes. I walked on down the path, taking my time, following her footsteps, but at the same time trying not to attract attention. I didn't know why I had decided to do that. It was purely instinctive, as if something deep inside was compelling me to keep going. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't someone who suspected my wife of something wrong without reason. But this morning's run, her strange behavior and her reluctance to have me run with her, all of it kept me on my toes. The path she'd left on led to a less busy part of the park where other runners rarely showed up. There were no noisy playgrounds here, no morning bicyclists or dog walkers. This part of the park was quiet, hidden behind tall trees, and resembled a corner of nature that people had forgotten. It was a place to hide from prying eyes if one so desired. I continued walking slowly, listening to every sound. Memories of our last few weeks swirled in my mind. The time we'd spent together had somehow started to dwindle quickly. We no longer talked the way we used to. Sarah became withdrawn, sharing her thoughts less. When I asked her questions, she answered briefly, without the same enthusiasm. Her gazes became more and more distracted and her conversations less personal. I couldn't remember the exact moment when it all started, but now it was apparent. Maybe this run was my mistake. Maybe I shouldn't have intruded on her personal space, on her time. But something told me it was more than that. The path gradually led me to a small clearing, where there were a few old benches and a couple of outdoor exercise machines, already covered in rust from time. There were no people here, and the place seemed long abandoned. Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, but other than the slight rustling of trees and birdsong, I heard nothing suspicious. I stood still, trying to figure out where she might have gone. Maybe I was just too late. Maybe she had already run on. The thought came into my head that I was doing something stupid, that this was all a figment of my imagination. After all, why would she hide anything? It's just a run, and maybe I'm just getting myself worked up for nothing. But there was something deep down inside that kept bugging me. I sat down on one of the benches, feeling my legs start to shake with fatigue. My gaze wandered across the empty clearing, and suddenly I noticed a subtle movement in the bushes nearby. It was too fast for me to tell exactly what it was, but I was alert. Perhaps it was just an animal, a squirrel running by, but my mind was already set to look for the oddity. A moment later, a man appeared from behind the bushes. He looked ordinary: tracksuit, sneakers, cap. Perhaps it was another jogger who had decided to take advantage of the quiet of this corner of the park. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing unusual, but then I noticed that he looked around, as if checking to see who was nearby. He didn't notice me sitting in the shade of the trees. The man stopped at the edge of the path, as if waiting for someone. My thoughts immediately began to escalate. I felt the tension building up inside. At that moment, I couldn't say exactly what had alerted me to his behavior, but something was wrong. It was too unnatural. His behavior, his waiting. He was clearly waiting for someone, and that someone could have been Sarah. I froze in place, trying not to move, watching what was happening. Time seemed to slow down. My heart was beating faster than it should after a simple jog. I tried to keep from jumping to spontaneous conclusions, but that feeling, the feeling that I was on the verge of something important, didn't let me go. A few minutes later, I saw Sarah. She stepped out from around the corner, calmly heading in the man's direction. My heart sank. I felt my head start to buzz and a lump rise in my throat. Sarah walked confidently, as if she knew she was expected. They didn't hug, they didn't touch. But that moment when she approached and they exchanged a brief glance made me freeze. They talked for a few seconds, then she gestured toward the wooded area. They both looked around, checking to see if there were any intruders, and after a moment, they disappeared into the shadows of the trees. I couldn't move from my seat. Everything was churning inside, but I didn't know what to do. It was a strange sensation, a mixture of disbelief, pain, and surprise. I didn't know what was happening, but it was as if my heart already knew. That meeting, those looks, they changed everything in an instant. It was as if the wall I'd been building so carefully in my mind had crumbled in front of me, pushing away all the disturbing thoughts. I took a step forward, but immediately froze. I couldn't follow them. Too much was hanging in the balance. I could feel the tension building, but I also realized that if I let this go now, I'd ruin everything we had. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they were just friends. Maybe it was something I couldn't understand. But in that moment, I thought I'd figured it out. I stood still for a long time, unable to move. Everything that was happening around me seemed like some ridiculous dream from which I could not wake up. My heart kept pounding and I couldn't get my thoughts together. Sarah had gone into the shade of the trees with this man, and this action seemed so blatant. But at the same time, I was desperately searching for an excuse for it. Maybe I had misunderstood something. Maybe it was a chance encounter. But then why was her behavior so strange? Fragments of our conversations kept rolling around in my head. Sarah had always said that running was a way for her to relax, to be alone with herself. There was always a sincerity in her words, a certainty, and I never doubted her intentions. But now it was starting to look different. Her morning runs, which I had thought were just a hobby of hers, suddenly became something mysterious. Memories of her leaving early in the morning and returning hours later seemed suspicious to me. I tried to collect my thoughts. Perhaps I was just overreacting emotionally. Maybe she met an acquaintance or coworker and they decided to talk. But then why did she leave with him? Why didn't she tell me she was seeing someone? Wouldn't it have been easier to tell the truth? Every movement seemed to slow down. The world around me seemed to become dense like a thick fog, and it was as if all my actions were through force. I walked closer to where they had disappeared, but I couldn't bring myself to follow them. Fear grew inside that I might find out the truth. I stopped a few steps away from the path they had taken and looked around. Outside, everything was quiet and peaceful. A light wind rustled the leaves, and the only sound was the beating of my own heart. I sat down on a bench and tried to calm down. It could have been a misunderstanding, and my suspicions could have been the result of fatigue. After all, I was really exhausted from running and not used to such physical exertion. Maybe my thoughts had gone off on the wrong track because of it. But despite all these attempts to calm myself down, the anxiety wouldn't go away. I remembered again how Sarah had become more closed off lately. It wasn't all at once, but gradually. I hadn't paid attention to it at first, perhaps due to stress at work or fatigue. We talked less, but I thought it was normal, because everyone has times when they just need to be alone with themselves. But now I began to see it in a different light. Her aloofness, her quiet morning runs, it all began to seem like part of something bigger. A few minutes passed, but it felt like I'd been sitting on that bench forever. The tension was building inside, and I couldn't find a way to let it out. All I could do was sit and wait, trying to figure out what to do next. Go after them? See what was going on? Or just leave like she asked and pretend nothing happened? These thoughts were running through my head when I suddenly heard the slight crunch of a branch. My body tensed instantly, and I looked in the direction the sound had come from. Sarah and the man appeared from behind the trees. They were walking at a leisurely pace, as if their conversation was calm and measured. But there was something wrong about it, even though outwardly everything seemed fine. Sarah was smiling, her face relaxed, as if she had just finished another routine morning run. The man, for his part, looked equally at ease. The looks they exchanged made me inwardly tense up even more. They moved closer, and I tensed, expecting Sarah to notice me. But she didn't look in my direction. Her gaze was directed somewhere in the distance, as if I was invisible. That strange feeling of not being noticed was ingrained in me. It felt like I was an extra in the world, an observer of what was going on between them. The man said something to her, and they went their separate ways. He walked away in the opposite direction from me, and Sarah turned in my direction, but her gaze remained detached, as if she were mentally somewhere else. I got up from the bench, and as she came closer, I took a step towards her. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my emotions were bubbling up inside me. Sarah stopped and looked at me for a moment, as if she hadn't expected to see me here. Her face took on a look of surprise for a moment, but immediately returned to its usual calm mask. "Oh, it's just an acquaintance," she replied so lightly that I didn't immediately realize it was meant to reassure me. "We sometimes cross paths on our jogs." She said it as if nothing unusual had happened, and everything I'd seen was perfectly normal. But her words sounded too superficial, too indifferent. I watched her carefully, trying to find the slightest hint of something that might explain her behavior. "Have you known him for a long time?" I continued, trying to make sense of my feelings. Sarah nodded, looking away, as if considering what else to say. "Yeah, probably for a few months now. He runs every morning too, just like me. Sometimes we cross paths," she said, as if the man was just a casual acquaintance, nothing more. But I sensed there was something more behind her words. I didn't know what else to say. My inner turmoil wasn't going away, but I couldn't directly accuse her of anything. Everything seemed normal, but my heart wouldn't settle. "Okay," I said finally, trying to suppress the tension that was building. "Why don't we go home?" Sarah nodded, and without another word, she headed back down the path. I followed her, feeling the distance between us growing larger, even though we were physically walking side by side. Questions were bubbling up inside me that I couldn't find answers to. It seemed that this morning's run had completely changed our world, even though outwardly nothing had happened. We walked back in silence, and the silence was oppressive. It weighed on me more than any words could. There seemed to be an invisible wall between us that we could not overcome. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was just tired and overly emotional. But deep inside, I already knew that wasn't true. My mind was spinning with thoughts of how strange she'd been acting since she'd suggested I come home. She clearly hadn't expected me to keep running after her. But what fueled my anxiety even more was that she didn't react when she saw me in the very place I wasn't supposed to go. It was like a sign that something was wrong, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. We were almost to the exit of the park when Sarah finally slowed down and stopped suddenly. She looked over her shoulder and looked at me with a slight look of surprise in her eyes, as if she realized for the first time that morning that I was still around. "Paul, why did you decide to keep running after all?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her voice sounded both surprised and perhaps even a little worried. "Why didn't you come home? I told you that you'd better get some rest, didn't I?" That question was exactly what I'd been waiting for all along. Why didn't she ask it right away when she first saw me? Why didn't she ask it when we first met after her casual conversation with that man in the park? "I wanted to support you all the way," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You were so into running that I thought, why don't I try to go all the way?" She looked at me carefully, as if considering my words, but then nodded, as if accepting that answer. Her reaction to my words was too superficial, though, as if she didn't want to go into a deeper discussion of what had happened. I'm just surprised, she said after a short pause. I thought you'd be back. You're so tired. Running isn't really your thing, you know that. But thanks for deciding to keep going. She smiled, but it seemed strained. It was the kind of smile that people use to hide their real emotions. I could sense that she hadn't expected to see me around, and she was clearly uncomfortable about it. She was used to morning runs being her personal time, and today I had disrupted that routine. Her answer sounded too nonchalant, as if she wanted to close the subject quickly, but something in her words made me tense inside. I sensed again that she was hiding something, even though everything looked normal. The question that was running through my mind remained unanswered. Why did she meet with him at the very moment when I should have left? We walked on in silence, and I didn't know how to continue the conversation. Contradictory feelings were struggling inside me. On the one hand, I realized that I shouldn't jump to conclusions, that it could have been a chance encounter, and that my anxiety was just the result of fatigue and emotion. But on the other hand, I was uneasy about her unexpected reactions and her desire to avoid discussing the details. When we finally reached the house, I felt my tension ease a little. Sarah entered first, heading straight to the bathroom to take a shower. I was left alone in the living room, sitting on the couch and listening to the sound of the water barely coming from behind the closed door. Thoughts swirled around in my head, but there was no concrete answer. I tried to convince myself that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. People meet on runs. It's normal. But I couldn't forget the moment she saw me and didn't immediately ask questions. Her surprise was too late, like she didn't immediately remember that I was supposed to be somewhere else. A few minutes passed and I heard the bathroom door open. Sarah came out, wiping her hair with a towel, and headed into the kitchen. "Are you okay?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of water. Her voice sounded calm without a hint of alarm. "Yeah, I'm fine," I answered, though I was actually seething with worry. I didn't want to get into an argument or confrontation, but I couldn't just let it go either. "I think you should run more often," she continued with a slight smile. "It really helps clear your head and keep you in shape." I nodded, but didn't say anything in response. Her words sounded like she was trying to take my mind off of what had happened this morning. It seemed like she was purposely trying to put things back on track, like nothing had changed between us. But I could sense that something was already wrong. She started packing for work. Usually, her morning packing went at a fairly relaxed pace, but today she was acting fast and focused, as if she needed to get out of the house faster. This made me even more anxious. "What are you planning to do today?" I asked, trying to pretend the conversation was on a familiar thread. Sarah froze for a moment, and then answered without taking her eyes off the bag. "I think I'll go to the store, then hit the gym. I need to stretch a little before the work week." That answer sounded logical, but her hasty packing kept me on my toes. The questions I wanted to ask remained unspoken. I didn't know how to approach discussing what had happened this morning. I didn't want to create unnecessary tension, but I couldn't leave it at that. "Why don't I come with you?" I suddenly suggested, not believing I'd taken that step. Sarah looked at me with slight surprise, as if she hadn't expected such a suggestion. "Really?" She grinned. "You've always hated going to the store. Besides, you need to rest after your run. I'll be fine on my own." Her answer was somewhere between a joke and the truth, but I could see the underlying reluctance in her tone, like she really didn't want me to come with her. That moment reinforced my doubts. "Yeah, you're right," I agreed reluctantly. "I should probably get some rest." She nodded as she continued packing. Her demeanor was calm, but it seemed to me that there was more to it than that. Maybe I was just imagining it, but every gesture she made, every phrase she said, left me unsettled. Soon she was gone, leaving me alone in the apartment. When the door closed behind Sarah, I was alone in the oppressive silence. Usually her leaving didn't cause me any anxiety. She just went about her business and I went about mine. But after that morning's incident and her strange answers, new questions began to arise in my mind. I could feel the anxiety that I had tried so desperately to suppress slowly growing inside me. The first thing I decided to do was to go back to the couch and try to distract myself by turning on the television. The familiar noise of the screen usually helped me de-stress, but it didn't work this time. I mindlessly switched channels, but I couldn't focus on anything. Sarah's every move, her look, her words. It was all memorized down to the smallest detail and kept running through my head like a replay. Why was she so surprised to see me in the park? Why hadn't she asked me that question right away, but only later, as if she had just remembered that I wasn't supposed to be there? And who was that man? A casual acquaintance? A jogger? Why did their meeting seem so tense to me? In the back of my mind, I knew there would be no simple explanation. I was beginning to doubt that I could really trust my instincts, because it had never occurred to me to suspect Sarah of anything like that before. But now her every gesture, every little thing, seemed suspicious. I got up from the couch, walked across the room, and stopped at the window. It was a normal weekday outside. The neighbors were walking their dogs. The children were playing in the park nearby. The world was still moving forward, despite my inner chaos. I stood looking outside, my thoughts drifting deeper and deeper into the morning's events. Running with Sarah was supposed to be a way to bond with her, to share her passion, but now it had all turned into a series of unanswered questions. The longer I pondered, the more the desire grew in me to find out what was really going on. Suddenly my phone vibrated, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "I'll be at the gym a little longer, don't expect me for lunch." A seemingly ordinary message, but in that moment it seemed like another piece of a puzzle I couldn't put together. She didn't mention anything about that man, didn't explain why she was so nervous when we met. I put my phone down on the table and sat back down on the couch, feeling the emotions boiling up inside of me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call Sarah right now and demand an explanation, but the other part of me realized that would only make things worse. I needed to gather my thoughts to figure out how to proceed with my behavior. Trying to distract myself from my anxious thoughts, I decided to do what always helped me calm down: do chores around the house. I started in the kitchen, wiping down surfaces and setting out dishes. The monotonous work helped distract me. But even here, the memories of the morning kept me busy. My mind replayed the moments I tried to analyze over and over again. Sarah's smile, her answers, her reaction to my questions. It was all too detached, too calm. When I was done with the kitchen, I decided to check the bedroom. Sarah was always neat, but today her packing seemed more hurried than usual. I opened the closet where she usually kept her gym clothes and suddenly noticed that her favorite sneakers that she always took to the gym were still there. It was a small thing, but it caught my eye. Sarah usually prepared for her workouts in advance, always taking the right things with her, especially the sneakers, which she found the most comfortable. But today, she left without them. I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling my anxiety rise again. It could have just been an accident, but at that moment I couldn't shake the thought that it was another sign that something was wrong. Why would she forget them if she was going to spend time at the gym? Or was she not going there at all? These thoughts started pulsing through my head, and I couldn't find a place to go. Everything seemed too suspicious, too different than usual. I remembered how she had tried to avoid discussing that man, how quickly she had left after our cursory questions and answers. It seemed like she was purposely trying to avoid my gaze and close the subject as quickly as possible. Perhaps this could have all been a mistake. Maybe I really was just getting myself worked up. But at that moment, it seemed more than a coincidence to me. I decided to take a little walk to unwind and try to calm myself down. Leaving the apartment, I walked down familiar streets, trying to find some connection to reality that wasn't clouded by doubt. But the further I walked, the more I felt it all pulling me back to those morning events. I stopped outside a small cafe that Sarah and I sometimes went to on the weekends. Memories came flooding back, and I suddenly realized that I hadn't been here with her in a long time. We had stopped spending time together outside of the house. Our walks and dinners had become infrequent. Her morning runs were taking up all her free time, and our conversations had become reduced to trivial discussions of domestic matters. That was part of the problem, too, but I had no way of realizing when exactly we started drifting apart. I ordered a takeaway coffee and continued on my way. As I walked, new questions began to form. Maybe she had found something or someone to replace our previous relationship? Maybe this man from the park wasn't just a casual acquaintance? I could feel my trust in her beginning to fray. When I got home, my phone vibrated again. It was another text from Sarah. I forgot my sneakers, but that's okay. Practice went great. Her tone was as light and carefree as it always was, but now I couldn't take the words the way I had before. It felt like she was trying to calm me down again, to distract me from the questions I might have asked. I sat down on the couch and held my phone in my hand, staring at the message, not knowing what to say. All I wanted was to understand what was going on. But Sarah didn't seem ready to talk. My inner tension had reached its limit. Several more hours passed. Time dragged on endlessly, and every minute I could feel the anxiety creeping up on me more and more. Finally, I realized that I just couldn't sit idly by any longer. I had to find out the truth. The sun was about to set when I decided I couldn't just sit around and wait any longer. The hours I'd spent thinking had seemed endless, but now everything was crystal clear. Sarah's words, her strange behavior, the missing details, everything pointed to the fact that she was hiding something. And as much as I hated to admit it, the thought had become too distinct to simply ignore. I began to wonder where she actually went if she forgot her sneakers. Who would work out at the gym without comfortable shoes? Too many inconsistencies, too many questions she wasn't giving direct answers to. I felt suspicion enveloping me in a tight ring, robbing me of the ability to think straight. My inner voice told me that I had to check it out for myself, to see with my own eyes what Sarah was trying to hide. All this time I'd been trying to give her a chance to explain herself, hoping that maybe I was just exaggerating. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I couldn't live in ignorance any longer, so I decided to do something that had seemed unthinkable to me before. I took my cell phone and left the house. My first thought was to drive to the gym to make sure she was there, but that seemed too easy. If she did go there, I could easily make sure she was honest, but something inside me told me she wouldn't be there. So I decided to take a different route. I remembered her talking about her runs and mentioned that man. Everything pointed to them meeting somewhere away from prying eyes. I remembered a place Sarah had once told me about, a small, almost abandoned park that was on the outskirts of town. We had never gone there together, but she had mentioned it in her jogging stories. It was clear to me at that moment that if she was really hiding something, it was likely that they would be there. I made it to the park faster than I expected. Inside, everything was boiling with nerves and tension, but I tried to keep my cool. The paths, hidden by dense vegetation, looked abandoned, as if no one ever came here. The silence was pressing, making my heart beat faster. I began to move forward slowly, listening for every sound. After a few minutes on the narrow path, I suddenly noticed figures in the distance. Two shadows against the greenery. They stood at the edge of the path, hidden by the dense trees. My heart froze for a moment, and then began to pound at a frantic pace. I stopped, listening and trying to get a good look at their faces. The man was the same one I'd seen this morning in the park. Sarah was standing next to him, her posture relaxed, as if she was perfectly safe. They were laughing, talking quietly, but confident enough not to worry about being overheard. I stood at a distance, watching them, and suddenly realized this was the moment I had been dreading. They exchanged glances, and the man leaned closer to Sarah, his hands sliding around her waist. That was all I needed to see. I stepped forward, and the branch beneath my foot crunched. The sound echoed through the quiet park, causing them both to turn around sharply. Sarah's eyes met mine immediately, and a look of surprise flashed across her face for a moment. But then she quickly pulled herself together. The man took a step back, his face contorted, but he didn't say anything. I couldn't believe my eyes, but at the same time, I had known for a long time that this was going to happen. I stepped closer, feeling the rage and pain clench inside me into a tight knot. Sarah was standing right in front of me, her gaze calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. It was her indifference that was literally burning me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice so cold that I was speechless for a moment. I couldn't believe she was asking this, as if the situation was completely normal. as if I was just part of an uncomfortable situation that she didn't expect. "I have to ask you the same thing," I breathed out, feeling my words struggle to get through the lump in my throat. "What does this all mean? Are you cheating on me?" Sarah looked at me with a slight squint, her face still calm and even slightly annoyed, as if this conversation was uncomfortable for her, not because she felt guilty, but because I was just in the way. "Paul, let's not make this any harder than it has to be," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "You can see it for yourself. Yes, I'm seeing him. So what?" Her voice was indifferent, which surprised me even more. She didn't try to justify or apologize, but on the contrary, her tone was as if she didn't see it as a problem. "How can you talk about it so calmly?" My voice was breaking from the tension. "We've been together for so many years and you're just betraying me like this?" Sarah looked at me as if my question didn't make sense. "Paul, let's be honest," she said, taking a step forward. "Look at you. You can't even run a few kilometers properly. And she nodded toward the man who had been silent the whole time, has a perfect body. He's in great shape, you know. I need something more than just cozy evenings at home." I stood there, stunned by her words. My head started spinning, and I couldn't believe she was seriously saying this. She's comparing me to this man just based on physicality? "Are you serious?" I whispered. "Is it all about his body?" Sarah shrugged as if that was the most obvious fact. "It's not just about that, but yeah, that's important too. I'm tired of you always acting like you have no needs. I have needs, Paul, and he fulfills them." Her words hit like punches. It wasn't an excuse or an attempt to explain her actions. It was a simple and cold statement. Her indifference seemed to me the most painful thing about the situation. She felt no remorse, no guilt for ruining our relationship. Her words about needing more sounded like an accusation against me, as if it was my fault she'd chosen someone else. I stood there, not knowing what to say. Pain, anger, and frustration all blended into one, and I felt everything inside clench. But the worst part was that Sarah wasn't even trying to hide her indifference. "If this is so important to you, then maybe we should have stopped this a long time ago," I said quietly, feeling my strength leaving me. Sarah nodded, her face remaining calm. "Maybe," she answered without a shadow of regret. That moment was the final point. After that conversation in the park, everything between Sarah and me was clear. We didn't talk about what had happened anymore, and when we got home, we each knew it was over. That evening, she packed up and left without a word. I was left alone in the empty apartment where we used to spend so much time together, and now her presence was gone, as if it had never existed. A few days passed, and I didn't fully realize that it was over. Her words still echoed in my head, especially that line about how I couldn't run properly, and that her lover had a great body. Those words crashed into my consciousness, and it was impossible to escape them. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that her betrayal hurt far more than any insults about her looks. But every time I was alone, those words came back to me, making me think them over and over again. The first few months after we broke up were an ordeal for me. I tried to forget her, tried not to think about what had happened, but it was impossible. Our shared memories, her face, her laughter, all these things kept popping up in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of loss, of her betraying not only me, but all the years we'd spent together. These memories caused me deep sadness and anger. Anger at her for betraying me, and anger at myself for letting it happen. Immersed in this mixture of emotions, I began to seek solace in food. It was the easiest and most accessible means of distracting myself from the pain. I ate everything: pizza, candy, fast food. Food became a way to drown out the inner emptiness, even if just for a moment. I started leaving the house less and less, avoided seeing friends and coworkers. Instead, I would sit on the couch, watch movies, eat, and it became my only way to cope with what was going on inside. Weeks turned into months. I fell deeper and deeper into my state of apathy. I didn't care that I was gaining weight, that my jeans were no longer buttoned, that I saw a different person in the mirror, exhausted, devastated. All of that seemed unimportant in the face of the pain I was in. Sarah's words about me being out of shape seemed petty in comparison to what she had done, but they continued to poison my thoughts. One morning, however, as I stood in front of the mirror as usual, I suddenly realized how much I had changed during that time. My face had rounded, my stomach had grown noticeably, and my shoulders had slumped. I hardly recognized myself. But it wasn't the physical change that shocked me the most. That didn't matter. But the way I had changed internally. I no longer felt like the person I used to be. I no longer felt in control of my life, as if everything that happened was the result of someone else's will rather than my own decisions. In that moment, I realized I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't let Sarah's betrayal continue to destroy me, my health, my life. I had lived in that darkness for too long. For too long, I had let it affect who I was. Her words about my appearance, which had once seemed like just part of the pain, were now something more. They became a challenge. And I decided that I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. From that day on, I began to slowly change my life. At first, it was small steps. I removed all fast food and sweets from my house, which used to be my main comfort. I started cooking simple and healthy meals. The first few days were difficult, especially when I would get the urge to eat my problems again. But I held on. Then I decided to go to the gym. I put off this decision for a long time because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to get back to exercising. But I remembered Sarah talking about how I couldn't even run a few kilometers, and that became my motivation. I decided that I would prove to myself and to her that I could change my life, that I could be fit again. The first visit to the gym wasn't easy. I felt my whole body protesting against the exertion. Every exercise was difficult, and I could barely make it through the first workout. But despite the muscle pain and fatigue, I felt that this was the right way. I realized that I couldn't stop, that every day of training was another step towards a new version of myself, one that I could be proud of. A few months passed, and I started to notice the first changes. My arms started to tone up, my stomach started to go away, and my face started to look slimmer again. I could feel my inner confidence returning along with the physical transformation. I was no longer the person who was broken and depressed after the breakup. I was starting to find myself anew. Working out became more than just a way for me to change my appearance. It became my way of taking back control of my life. I went to the gym every day, watched my diet, and watched step by step as I got stronger, as my body transformed. It wasn't easy, but every effort paid off 100-fold. A year after I first decided to change my life, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the person I saw a year before. I was in better shape than I had ever been. My muscles were crisp, my stomach was gone, and my shoulders and chest had gained strength and shape. I felt strong not only physically but also internally. All the pain I had felt over Sarah's betrayal was in the past. She no longer controlled my thoughts, my condition, my life. I remembered her words about that man having a great body and chuckled. I knew now that physicality wasn't just a matter of looks, it was a matter of who you wanted to be. I was no longer striving to prove something to her or anyone else. I proved it to myself. I had become the person I'd always wanted to be, strong, confident, and most importantly, free of the past. Sarah was a thing of the past, but her words helped me find a new purpose, a new meaning to life. I realized that you should never let someone destroy your faith in yourself. I learned not to depend on the opinions of others, but to base my life on my own values and aspirations. I could now look at myself in the mirror and be proud of who I had become. Although this journey was full of pain and disappointment, I realized that it made me stronger.